a kidney, 2 hearts, and a miracle that challenged all possibilities. Hello, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe below. The lights of the surgical center flashed on Friends Day. That was another normal day for Ricardo. He was preparing for another medical examination, while the sun was shining outside and the streets were already full of people. He thought it wasn't too much. Who doesn't take a medical examination from time to time? However, the fate. He plays his own cards, doesn't he? As always, Ricardo greeting the receptionist when he entered the office with a smile on his face. The so familiar smell of the antiseptic in the air no longer bothered him. While sitting in the waiting room, distractedly browsing an outdated magazine, he did not know that his life was about to change completely. "Ricardo Silva?" asked the nurse. He got up, tuned his shirt, and advanced towards her through the hallway. His heart was tight as the doctor waited for him with a serious appearance. The doctor pointed to the chair in front of him and said, "Sit down, Ricardo. We have to discuss your exams." In that cold and impersonal room, Ricardo heard the words that would change his life. "Your kidneys are failing, Ricardo." Moreover, the situation is more serious than expected. The world seemed to be slowing down. The walls of the office seemed to close over him as the doctor continued to speak, explaining details that he could barely understand. His mind danced with words like transplant, dialysis, and medication, but they didn't make any sense. That's not for him. Not at the moment. That day, Ricardo left the hospital as a new man. Once so blue, the sky looked gray now. In the past, the streets seemed so lively, but now they seemed like distant shadows. Every step he took towards the house was a step towards a new reality he never imagined. Ricardo cried that night alone in his room. He was depressed by the future he thought he had lost, by the dreams that now seemed so distant. However, a spark of determination began to shine in her chest in the midst of tears. Although he had no idea what tomorrow would bring, he knew that this would not be his last story. Although the diagnosis may have changed everything, Ricardo decided in this time of darkness that he would write the next chapters of his life with courage and hope. He did not know that his journey was just beginning, and that destiny still had many surprises to reveal. 2 years have passed since the diagnosis that completely transformed Ricardo's life. Previously just a workplace, the accounting office became his refuge, a place where he could dive into spreadsheets and numbers, pretend that everything was going well. The smell of fresh coffee was spreading through the air that Monday morning, mixed with the familiar sound of the keys being typed. Ricardo was not aware that his routine was about to be changed. The chief accountant called everyone's attention, shaking hands. "I want to introduce the new accountant assistant. It's Letizia." That's how he saw her for the first time. Letizia entered the room with a confident smile and a folder of documents in one hand and a calculator in the other. His eyes shone with enthusiasm and nervousness. "Ricardo," called the leader, "could you present our system to Letizia? She'll stay at the station next to you." Ricardo adjusted his glasses and sat down. He was moving away and focused only on balance sheets and tax returns lately. However, something aroused Letizia's curiosity. "Hi, Ricardo," she said, extending her hand. "I hope that our work will be productive." Ricardo felt an unexplained feeling of familiarity as he shrugged his hand, as if the universe had planned to fill your world with magic numbers. The following days were incredible. In addition to the audit tasks and financial reports, Ricardo was eager to get to the office because of Letizia's pleasant company. He taught her about accounting software and tax procedures, but he himself learned to see beyond numbers and find joy in small daily interactions. Letitia was more than just a colleague. She treated him as an experienced accountant, not as a sick person, without knowing of his medical condition. More than any positive balance sheet, it was revitalizing his spirit. The hours spent in the office were exorbitant, The shared lunches were about the latest changes in tax legislation, financial management plans for home rides, and typing errors that completely changed the meaning of a report. Amidst the Excel calculators and spreadsheets, a true friendship was developing. Ricardo soon began to open. They shared stories of difficult clients, aspirations to open their own office, and fears of unexpected audits. They got closer when they found out they were students at the same College of Accounting Sciences. The synchronization was so natural that it quickly became the dynamic duo of the office. Letitia gave Richard a new perspective on his monotonous life. It was similar to a new accounting software, simplifying and increasing efficiency. Furthermore, unwittingly, Ricardo was becoming a mentor to Letizia, helping her unravel the puzzles of the company's accounting. Thus, a friendship that would challenge fate was born between income tax returns and endless audits. A relationship based on mutual understanding, professional support, and a shared passion for organized numbers. Although Ricardo and Letizia were not aware, they were embarking on a journey that would change their lives forever away from the accounting office. Ricardo and Letizia left the accounting office at 6 p.m., exhausted after another day of balances and statements. The sun set on the horizon, illuminating the sky with tones of orange and pink, as if the city's skyscrapers wrapped it in a picture. "How about a coffee?" Letizia suggested, the smile shining on her tired face. Ricardo hesitated for a moment, thinking of the enormous amount of medicine waiting for him at home. However, something in Letizia's gaze made him agree. They sat in the corner cafeteria and started talking about things outside the spreadsheets and numbers, between the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of conversations. Ricardo felt willing to share his fears and hopes for the first time in a long time. He started, turning the cup between his hands, saying, "You know, Letizia, sometimes I wonder if there is more in life than debts and credits." Letizia looked attentively at him, his eyes shining with understanding. "Life is like a great book of books, Ricardo. There are positive and negative points, but it is what we do with these numbers that matters in the end." That night marked the beginning of a friendship that would extend beyond the boundaries of the office. In the following months, Richard and Letizia became a couple. In addition to sharing the work, they also shared aspirations, fears, and successes. Richard helped Letizia overcome an abusive relationship and heard her tears until dawn. Moreover, when Richard's father died, Letizia held his hand at the funeral, his silent presence being more comforting than any word. They worked together to cope with college routines, laughing at the teachers' unpleasant jokes and providing support to each other during the tough weeks of exams. Richard was present when Letizia announced her desire to be a mother, with a face full of joy and fear. Moreover, when Richard became more ill, Letizia supported him and promised to be with him on every step. Life continued to flow, bringing joy and sadness. Richard was the father-in-law of Letizia's wedding, and his heart burst of joy when he saw his radiant friend wearing a white dress. Furthermore, Richard first called Letizia when he finally found love, with his eyes shining, telling about the boy who had stolen his heart. However, not all flowers were flowers. Richard hurt slowly and cruelly. The hemodialysis night became more common, and fear of the uncertain future floated over his head. However, Letizia remained present, holding his hand and reminding him that he was not alone in the darkest nights. The pandemic has brought new difficulties. Their friendship only strengthened as the world seemed to have stopped. Coffee was replaced by video calls and text messages turned into virtual hugs. In addition, Letizia accompanied Richard to the hospital, protected by masks and unconditional love. This friendship that began as a link between tables and numbers had turned into something exceptional and valuable. It was a bond that transcended time and space. Richard and Letizia were more than friends. They were a chosen family, platonic twin souls united by a higher destiny. So Richard and Letizia stood side by side as the world revolved and life followed its unpredictable course. They were the living proof that some connections are durable and able to overcome any obstacle fate can put. That Friday afternoon, the office was empty. Most of the staff had already left, looking forward to the weekend. But as always, Ricardo and Letizia continued to work until later. Waiting for a report to be prosecuted, Ricardo browsed the internet distracted. His tired gaze ran through the screen, stopping at an article about kidney transplants. Letizia observed attentively the change in the expression of the friend. "What happened, Ree?" Turning her chair to face him, she asked, "Looks worried." For a moment, Ricardo hesitated, his fingers trembling nervously on the mouse. Eventually, he breathed heavily and decided to start the game. "Reed, there's something I've never told you," he started, his voice getting very soft. Letizia listened attentively as the words flowed, her eyes grabbing with every detail of Richard's condition. He discussed the diagnosis, his kidney failure, and the need for a transplant. His voice conveyed a combination of fear and resignation. "The doctors told me there was no other option." Ricardo avoided his friend's gaze and concluded, "I'll need a transplant sooner or later." There followed a silence that seemed to weigh tons. Letizia processed the data with a face full of surprise and determination. Finally, she spoke the words that would transform everything. "I will be your donor," she declared. Unbelieving, Ricardo raised his eyes. "What?" he asked, surely without understanding. "You heard me," replied Letizia with a firm and determined voice. "I'll offer my kidney for you." At that moment, everything seemed to stop. Thanks for sitting. Ricardo felt his legs weaken. "You can't understand by reading. It is a complicated situation. A lot of bureaucracy and exams. It must be compatible and—" However, Letizia interrupted him and placed his hand on his. "Listen, Ricardo. This is not an impulse choice. I want to do that. No, that's what I have to do. You are my best friends and members of my family. I'll go if I can help." Ricardo started crying. He was invaded by a mixture of gratitude, fear, and hope. "However, Red, it's a significant loss. That's not something I can ask you for." Letizia smiled, that smile that always illuminated Richard's dark days. "You're not asking. I'm willing to offer. And when it's for someone we love, that's not a sacrifice." Since then, something has changed between them. It was no longer just a friendship. It was a strong bond, a promise made with smiles and tears. Letizia held Richard firmly, swinging on his shoulder, as if he could protect him from all the evils of the world. Letizia whispered, "It's gonna be all right. It's God who decides, not me." So everything went well. Once just a workplace, the office now witnessed an act of dedication and love. At that time, the spreadsheets and reports seemed insignificant. Richard and Letizia remained embraced, united by a promise that went beyond words, as the sun set outside, painting the sky in golden tones. A promise of life, hope, and a future that seemed unattainable before. So a new page in their history began on that seemingly ordinary Friday. A page in the book of their lives written with invisible but lasting ink. The friendship of Richard and Letizia was strengthening every day, like a deep oak in the ground. That first morning at the accounting office, their lives were intertwined in ways that neither of them could have foreseen. Ricardo's phone ringed one autumn afternoon. His heart tightened when he heard the embarrassed voice of Letizia on the other side of the line. "Could you come? I need you." He abandoned everything and quickly ran to her apartment. She approached Letizia, who was shrinking on the couch with her red eyes of so much crying. Ricardo had never trusted his boyfriend, who had revealed his true nature. The marks that Letizia had on her arm told a story that words could not tell. Ricardo sat next to her and hugged her in a quiet hug. There was no need for words. As she collapsed in his arms, he was there, always present and comforting. The night passed and they continued like this, Ricardo being the security that Letizia needed. Months later, Letizia was the pillar of Richard. Her father's funeral demonstrated her resistance. Ricardo, who always had the same strength, seemed like an empty casing in front of the box. Letitia was present, holding her hand and offering a shoulder so that she could cry. She guided him through those dark days, reminding him to eat, sleep, and breathe. However, they weren't all sadnesses. Life was infinitely wise, and also gave them moments of pure joy. One of those moments was the marriage of Letizia. The proud father-in-law Ricardo watched his friend walk through the hall, radiant in his white dress. When their eyes met, they shared a complicit smile. They had reached that point together. Letizia was the first to know that Richard finally found love. On the terrace of her apartment, laughing and dreaming under the stars, they celebrated with a bottle of cheap wine. Letizia raised her toast cup and said, "You deserve all the happiness in the world, Ree." Life had ups and downs, but it went on. There are nights when Letizia helps Richard understand complicated concepts of accounting, preparing him for the college exams. After days of discontent at work, one consoled the other after a challenging meeting. Besides, there was a constant shadow of Ricardo's disease, of course. Letitia was present at all medical visits, examinations, and hemodialysis sessions, being a constant and reassuring presence. During the procedures, she held his hand, entertained him with bad jokes when he was nervous, and always reminded him that he was not alone in this battle. Ricardo and Letizia woven a tapestry of moments shared with laughter and tears, victories and defeats. Each thread represented a shared experience, each node a silent promise of being there for each other, regardless of circumstances. Thus, these two friends continued their journey together as the world and seasons changed. Today, their lives are so interconnected that it is difficult to identify where one began and the other ended. They had discovered an absolute truth in a world full of doubts, that love in its purest and most unselfish form can overcome any obstacle. Besides, there are times when the only thing we need is a friend to take us back to the light. On the hospital wall, the clock seemed to move slowly, with each tic-tac echoing like a distant drum. While holding the results of his final examinations in his hands, Ricardo was sitting in the waiting room. Letitia held her hand by her side, her thumb drawing comforting circles on her skin. The white, suffocating corridor seemed to swallow them, the smell of disinfectant mixed with the feeling of fear breathing. Her shoes made a bloody noise on the linoleum floor as the nurses passed in a hurry. Whenever the door opened, Ricardo felt his heart beating and hoped to hear his name. Finally, the silence was interrupted by the nurse's voice, asking, "Ricardo Silva?" Letitia got up with her bare legs and shrugged her hand one last time before going to Dr. Marcos. The doctor was waiting for them, their worried eyes hidden by a mask of professionalism. "Ricardo," said Doctor. "The results are not good," Martin said in a serious and compassionate voice. "Your kidneys are failing faster than expected." The world seemed to be slowing down. Ricardo could feel the beating of his own heart beating in his ears as the sound of the doctor stifled his words. Fragments of words, such as immediate dialysis, transplant list, and time is essential, penetrated the shock fog surrounding him. Letizia held her hand stronger, insisting on coming in with him. His firm and determined voice cut off Richard's turmoil, asking, "What can we do, doctor?" "Something." The doctor removing the glasses and rubbing the nose bridge, Martins sighed. We need to start hemodialysis immediately. Besides, we'll put Ricardo at the top of the transplant list." However, he hesitated, looking directly at Richard, saying, "We need a miracle." The following hours passed at a slow pace. Ricardo was taken to do additional tests and was subjected to tube and needle implants on his body. By seeing his own blood flowing through the dialysis machines, he finally discovered what was happening. Letizia never left her side. During the procedures, she held his hand and told jokes to distract him from pain, whispering words of encouragement when he was afraid. Ricardo finally stopped crying that night, lying on the hospital bed with the constant sound of the machines in the background. After sitting in the chair next to the bed, Letizia hugged him and let him fall apart. He whispered, "I'm so scared, Lee." "I know, Rye," she said, her embarrassed voice. "Remember what I told you? This requires our cooperation. Let's fight and win." Richard and Letizia remained together, hugged, facing fear of the unknown as the night advanced. The city slept all night, away from the drama inside that hospital room. She did not rely on the strength of a friendship capable of moving mountains, but the disease had finally shown her clutches. Moreover, in the heart of Letizia grew a fierce determination, while the machines remained silent. To save her friend, she would do anything. They would face every moment together, step by step, beat by beat, for the real battle was just beginning. When Ricardo and Letizia arrived at the central hospital, the sun had barely risen. Although the cold air of the morning cut off their faces, the heat of hope warmed them inside. It was the right time. After months of consultations, examinations, and a waiting that seemed endless, finally came the time when everything could change. It looked like the hospital corridor was longer than ever. The sound of both's accelerated heartbeats mixed with the echo of each step. Letizia held Richard's hand firmly, as if she had the ability to convey all her determination through this action. "Number 507, the nurse called. "It's your time." Mr. Mendez's office was a quiet refuge in the midst of the hospital's turmoil. Although the doctor welcomed them with a kind smile, their eyes reflected a sense of concern. "Well, I have the compatibility test results," he started, leaving a thick folder. Letizia and Richard stopped breathing. At that moment, everything seemed to be frozen. The doctor continued saying, "Letitia, your blood type is compatible with that of Ricardo. Actually, you would be the perfect donor." Both faces shone with joy. Letizia held Richard's hand with an air of relief in his eyes, although Dr. Mendez got serious and raised his hand. "But there's a problem." The silence continued. His voice was filled with sadness when he stated, "Unfortunately, we cannot continue with the donation due to our policies and regulations. Letitia is not married to Richard, nor is she a close relative to him. We cannot carry out the transplant under these circumstances because of the law." It was as if all the air in the room had been ejected. The floor disappeared under Ricardo. Letizia, who was always so determined, let a feeling of defeat escape. But that doesn't make sense," she cried out, her voice covered with despair and indignation. "I would like to contribute. It's my decision." The doctor shrugged his head, his eyes shining with compassion. "Believe me, I understand. However, there is a reason why the rules exist. Even if I try to ignore them, it's not possible." The shock still paralyzed Ricardo, who remained silent. All his dreams of a prosperous future fell into his hands. Dr. Mendez turned his attention to a corridor. "There's an office at the end of that hallway. You have the option of signing up on the waiting list for a deceased donor." Letizia rose abruptly and pulled Richard to herself. "Come on, Ree. It doesn't end here." They walked through the hallway helpless, their shoulders bent by disappointment. Every person in line to sign up carried a story of hope and suffering, and the queue seemed to have no end. Letizia forced Richard to look into his eyes while holding his face between his hands. Thank you, Ricardo. That's just an obstacle. We're going to get over it, see? I promise to be by your side, and that's where I'm going to stay. Ricardo sat down slowly, unable to articulate anything. In his mind, the doctor's no echoed, a death sentence disguised as bureaucracy. However, Letizia felt that something lit up in her gaze in that cold and impersonal corridor. A firm determination that does not accept defeat. She still didn't know how, but she would find a method. The battle was not lost. It was only the beginning of a completely new war. Richard and Letizia hugged each other as the sun continued to shine in the sky. It's not possible. The shock still paralyzed Ricardo, who remained silent. All his dreams of a prosperous future fell into his hands. Dr. Mendez turned his attention to a corridor. There's an office at the end of that hallway. You have the option of signing up on the waiting list for a deceased donor. Letizia rose abruptly and pulled Richard to herself. Come on, Ree. It doesn't end here. They walked through the hallway helpless, their shoulders bent by disappointment. Every person in line to sign up carried a story of hope and suffering, and the queue seemed to have no end. Letizia forced Richard to look into his eyes while holding his face between his hands. Thank you, Ricardo. That's just an obstacle. We're going to get over it, see? I promise to be by your side, and that's where I'm going to stay. Ricardo sat down slowly, unable to articulate anything. In his mind, the doctor's no echoed, a death sentence disguised as bureaucracy. However, Letizia felt that something lit up in her gaze in that cold and impersonal corridor. A firm determination that does not accept defeat. She still didn't know how, but she would find a method. The battle was not lost. It was only the beginning of a completely new war. Richard and Letizia hugged each other as the sun continued to shine in the sky, illuminating a world different from what was happening inside that hospital. United by pain, by friendship, and by a wounded hope that didn't want to die. Dr. Carlos Mendonca's office was a maze of papers and books related to law. The ancient scent of coffee was mixed with the smell of desperate hope that Richard and Letizia brought with them. The lawyer looked at them over the reading glasses, his tired but firm eyes, sitting behind a robust oak table. He stated that you want to challenge the system as a conclusion rather than a question. Despite the trembling of his hands, Letizia stood firmly. It can't be that easy, Doctor. There must be a method to bypass this absurd law. The doctor resting on his chair, Mendonca sighed. I'm not going to lie to you. Look, it's going to be a tough battle. The aim of the system was to prevent donors from being forced to donate, but sometimes this ends up preventing genuine altruistic actions. Finally, Ricardo spoke, his rusty voice of emotion, after being silent until then. Doctor, I didn't ask for that. Letizia made a proposal. She's not only my best friend, but also my family. If there's a chance, even if it's minimal. The lawyer's eyes softened as he watched them for a long time. He then pulled a block of notes with a determined move. Of course, we're in a fight. However, it is imperative that you be aware that this will have physical, emotional, and financial consequences. The following weeks were full of emotions. Clear nights preparing testimony and endless days at the Implacables Forum. Ricardo and Letizia alternated between the court and the hospital, where the dialysis sessions continued. The media began to get interested in the case. The headlines yelled, "Amiga fights injustice for the right to donate kidneys." Upon leaving the forum, reporters approached them with microphones on their tired faces. The prosecutor questioned Letizia's intentions during an agitated afternoon. How can we ensure that there is no coercion, ma'am? Maybe a hidden debt? Letizia got up furious. Sir, my only debt in this place is to my conscience. How can I watch my best friend die and know I can save him? The court remained silent, with his excited voice touching even the most skeptical hearts. Days evolved into weeks, and then weeks into months. Ricardo's health was unstable, and he struggled daily to maintain hope. Letizia was his rock, alternating between work, the court, and the prolonged nights in the hospital. Finally came the day of the verdict, after what seemed to be an eternity. The courtroom was crowded and the air was heavy. Letizia and Richard sat side by side, hands intertwined and hearts accelerated. The judge sneaked while adjusting his glasses. After careful consideration, this court takes a decision in favor of the applicants. Letizia and Ricardo can make a kidney donation. The world stopped for a moment. Reality struck them like a breaking wave. They had triumphed. The room exploded in applause. Richard held Letitia's arm as they left the court, bathed by the sunlight and the relief of victory. "Reed, I don't know how to express my gratitude." She smiled, her eyes wet with tears. "Don't thank you yet. After the surgery, keep this a secret. Remember, we need a kidney transplant." So they walked together into the future, not just as friends, but as symbols of a battle that transcended the law, demonstrating that love in its purest form can transform destinies. It's 3:47 in the morning, according to the clock hanging on the hospital wall. In the waiting room, Richard was sitting with his red eyes fixed on the door where Letizia had disappeared hours before. The smell of disinfectant and fear spread through the air, mixed with the distant voices and sounds of monitors. 24 hours. His life would be transformed by the missing surgery. 16 hours of hope, promises, and a future that seemed close. However, that unpredictable destiny player had different plans. Letizia went out, the pale face contrasting with the blue mask, when the door opened. Now, his contained tears flooded through his eyes, which used to be filled with life. She started by saying "Rye" with a trembling voice. "I had a positive outcome for COVID-19. The world collapsed. The air became scarce and the walls of the hospital seemed to close over them. Ricardo felt that his stomach had been hit. He whispered, "No," his only defense against the cruel world. "It's impossible. Not for now." Letitia threw herself in her arms and slipped. "I'm sorry. I am deeply sorry." The days that followed were full of fear. Letitia was in isolation because of a virus that threatened her health and her dream, which both had fought so hard to. Ricardo continued his dialysis sessions, fighting against despair every minute. The outside seemed to have stopped. The news about the pandemic invaded television. Masks were mandatory, and fear spread as fast as the virus. However, for Richard and Letizia, time dragged, with each day being an eternity of doubt. His only contact was via video calls. While Letizia was coughing and struggling to breathe, Richard remained helpless. Even when her voice failed, she insisted, "It's gonna be all right. Let's win this together." The weeks have passed. The date of surgery seemed so close now. The doctors talked about safety protocols, new tests, and remarking. Every word put more weight on Ricardo's already tired shoulders. Ricardo finally collapsed one night, alone in his hospital room. The tears he had held for so long fell freely on his hands. It was excessive. Every obstacle has been overcome, every fight has been won, and now it's the end. An invisible opponent threatened to tear him out of his only hope. However, in the midst of despair, his phone vibrated. The message was sent by Letizia. "Is it possible that you remember what I told you in court? Keep fighting. We're working on it together." "Always." Ricardo was attracted to those simple but powerful words. He remembered all the things they had faced and every obstacle they had overcome. This was just another battle in his prolonged war. Time continued to pass. Letitia began to improve slowly. Her cough decreased and her breathing improved. Moreover, Every small triumph increased hope. After a long wait, the news finally arrived that they both expected. The virus had killed Letizia. New tests have been carried out, and precautions have been increased. After that, like the sunlight after the storm, a new date was set. Richard and Letizia met in the hospital garden on the eve of the remarketed surgery, keeping a safety distance, but their hearts were closer than ever. Letizia smiled determinedly behind the mask. "We start our new life tomorrow." Ricardo agreed, feeling a mixture of hope and fear. They had faced bureaucracy, the law, and now a global pandemic. They would face everything fate would reserve for them tomorrow. Richard and Letizia remained there as the sun set on the horizon, illuminating the sky with shades of hope. They remained silently firm in the certainty that their union was stronger than any adversity the world could cast against them. In the early hours of the morning, the lights of the surgical center began to flash. It was July 20th, Friends' Day. Richard and Letizia would never forget that date. Only the gentle sound of the cardiac monitors and the whispers of the doctors preparing to break the silence. Richard was lying on his waist, his eyes fixed on the white ceiling, and his heart was a mixture of hope and fear. Letitia smiled behind the surgical mask next to her in another cloak, her eyes conveying all the love and strength that words could not express. The surgeon looked at Letizia and asked, "Are you ready?" She decidedly refused. "Better than ever." The meticulous dance of surgery began as soon as the doors closed. Hours passed as minutes and minutes passed like eternities. Friends and family were waiting in the hallway, praying to protect the operating room. The doctors worked in the room with almost divine precision. A gift of life, the kidney of Letizia, was carefully removed. Every cut and every suture was done with the awareness that a miracle was happening. The room remained in reverent silence when the organ was finally transferred to Ricardo. All his eyes were focused on the monitors, waiting and praying. And so it was. The kidney started working quickly. The room heard a general sigh of relief, followed by smiles hidden under the masks. It was like I was celebrating my own life for that moment. Hours later, as he recovered, Ricardo slowly opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was the radiant face of Letizia in the bed next to her. "How are you?" they all asked together and laughed, filling the room with an indescribable joy. The following days were devoted to recovery and discovery. Every new exam, every indication of improvement, it was like Ricardo was coming back to life. His skin was getting redder and his eyes were shining with a vitality that had long since disappeared. Letitia was always present, even during her recovery. They walked together through the corridors of the hospital, laughing at internal jokes and imagining a future that now seemed infinite. Richard held Letizia's hand in the hospital garden a week after the surgery. His voice was filled with emotion when he said, "You know, they say I got your kidney, but I actually got a lot more. I had a second chance in my life." Letizia smiled with tears in her eyes. She replied, "And I gained the certainty that miracles exist. They happen daily, in the simple things and in the gestures of love." The afternoon sun bathed the garden, illuminating the flowers. It was like everyone was celebrating with them. At that moment, Richard and Letizia became aware that their journey was much more than just living a renewed life. It was about courage, love, and the incredible human ability to overcome obstacles. They returned to their bedrooms, hands and hearts united, knowing that this was not the end of their story, but only the beginning of a new stage. A chapter written with gratitude, sealed with the unbreakable bond of a friendship that transcended body and soul. So, on Friends' Day, two hearts beat at the same time. This is a miracle and a clear proof that pure and altruistic love can overcome even the most challenging obstacles.